Let's talk about war. It's a word we've known forever. But what does it actually mean in the 21st century? Because its definition is changing faster than ever before. When we hear that word, we get this picture in our heads, right? We imagine two armies lining up on some battlefield, something straight out of a history book. But the reality of conflict today, oh, it's so much blurrier than that. We are just bombarded with all these new terms trying to describe it. We hear people talk about hybrid wars, where things like disinformation and economics are the real weapons. Or asymmetric wars, where a global superpower can get tied up in knots by a small group with a few drones and a laptop. And then there's what a lot of scholars are calling new wars, which just completely erase the lines between organized crime, human rights abuses, and what we used to think of as combat. And all of these labels, hybrid, asymmetric, new, endless, they've created this incredibly confusing landscape. It makes it almost impossible to figure out what's really going on and what rules, if any, still apply. So where does that leave us? Well, to really get a handle on where we are now, we've got to go back. We need to take a look at how this whole idea of war was constructed in the first place. Okay, so before we can dive into how the rules are breaking down, we first have to understand what those rules even were. Let's build the classical model. All right, the foundation for what we think of as traditional war was built on something called the Westphalian system. Now, this came about after decades of absolutely brutal religious wars in Europe. And eventually, the states basically said, okay, enough. We need a rule book. And the number one rule was sovereignty. The idea that each state is the master of its own territory. You stay out of my business, I'll stay out of yours. And this system created a kind of formal contest with really clear rules and boundaries. War was something states did to other states. It was fought by professional armies, which were kept totally separate from, say, the local police force. And, this is the big one, it had a declared beginning and a negotiated end. There was a clear, bright line between being at war and being at peace. And the guy who gave us the core logic for this whole model was the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. He had this famous idea that war shouldn't just be some chaotic, emotional brawl for total destruction. No, instead, he saw war as a calculated political instrument, a rational tool. Think of it this way. A state has a goal. It tries diplomacy, but that fails. So it uses limited, controlled violence to achieve that specific goal. War was just another tool in the toolbox, not the end-all be-all. But as you can probably guess, this neat and tidy model of warfare, well, it couldn't last. The very forces of modernity that helped create it would eventually start to tear it apart. And you can see these cracks forming over a couple of centuries. First, the French Revolution comes along, and suddenly war isn't just one king versus another, it's an ideology trying to remake the entire world. Then you get the World Wars, where nationalism and industry turn entire societies into war machines, blurring that line between soldier and civilian. And finally, the nuclear bomb. The Cold War made an all-out war between superpowers basically unthinkable because everybody knew it would be the end of everything. So after the Cold War ends, this old framework, this whole rule book, it pretty much collapses. And what rises from the ashes is a new, much more confusing reality, what a lot of scholars are now calling new wars. And here's the crucial point. The very definition of war, the who, what, where, and why, has completely transformed. We've gone from state armies fighting on clear battlefields for political goals to these decentralized networks fighting a global, borderless conflict. And they're not funded by state taxes. They're often funded by crime and driven by things like identity politics instead of straight-up conquest. And if you want the ultimate example of this massive shift, just look at the War on Terror. It's the conflict that has really defined so much of the 21st century. It is the textbook case of this new borderless reality. Think about it. The War on Terror just shattered all those old distinctions we had. War versus peace? It's open-ended. There's no clear finish line. Soldier versus civilian? Well, you're targeting non-uniformed members of a network, not an army. And home versus abroad? The battlefield is global, so that line has been completely erased. So you might be asking yourself, okay, why does any of this matter? Why do we care about these definitions? Well, the consequences of all this blurriness are enormous. How we define war shapes how we fight it, what laws apply, and what kind of powers a government can claim to have. This confusion makes it almost impossible to even count how many wars are going on. For example, a common academic definition says that for a conflict to even be called a war, it has to have at least 1,000 battle-related deaths in a year. 1,000. It's a totally arbitrary number, and it just shows how hard it is to get a clear picture. If we can't even agree on when a war starts, how can we possibly know when one ends? And maybe, just maybe, this is the most fitting part of all. The original, Old Germanic root of the word war literally meant to confuse. It's like language itself knew where we were all headed. And that leaves us with some really critical questions that are going to define our future. In a world where conflict can be permanent and the battlefield can be anywhere, what does it even mean to be safe? And more importantly, what will it take to ever truly be at peace?